There have been times where when I've attempted, in the past to be maybe a more holistic version of myself, that I have been burned, And so the message I kept getting was be a good girl, show up the way you're supposed to. And that didn't mitigate or undermine my self-advocacy, but it did, how I rationalized it? I always said I was being strategic. It was a game of chess, right? Everything was a game of chess, and I just had to be strategic in how I showed up and navigated and did all of these things. Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready?
Today's guest is Heather Pridemore, a remarkable leader and visionary in the realms of professional development and creative exploration. As the CEO, founder, and coach at Pridemore Coaching, Heather has dedicated herself to empowering first-generation and rising professionals, guiding them toward achieving personalized career success. Her unique approach combines over a decade of corporate experience with deep expertise in leadership and communication, positioning her as a sought-after mentor for those aspiring to elevate their careers. Heather recently began the process of acquiring a small business where her commitment to creativity and innovation shine. This venture highlights her ability to merge artistic vision with strategic business insights. With a background spanning arts, nonprofits, the automotive industry, and technology sectors, Heather brings a wealth of experience and a versatile perspective to her endeavors, driving change and fostering growth across various industries. As an engaging speaker and the host and producer of the podcast Small Acts of Rebellion, Heather inspires her audience to challenge the shoulds of corporate culture, advocating for a life led with authenticity and aligned with personal values.
Thank you for that, Rose. So if anyone has noticed a little bit of a role reversal, I am not going to be the host today. I'm actually in the hot seat, and Rose is going to interview me. Now, if you don't know Rose, she was in the previous episode of this podcast. And so I would urge you to go listen, learn a little bit about Rose, and then come back to this episode.
So great. Thank you, Heather. And that's so on brand for you, really lifting other voices up, even when you're the guest today. I think that's a perfect segue into advocating for yourself, advocating for others. What does that look like? And I have an opening question for you a little bit here. So when reflecting on the skills or mindsets that have helped you get to where you are now, can you trace any of those back to your formative years? We want to hear a little bit of the story of Heather.
This is no secret. Like, I grew up pretty blue collar, and it was different at different phases of my youth. I mean, there were times as a kid that we were on food stamps, and I remember getting like my finger pricked so they could see if I was anemic, and then they would give us like a gallon of milk, and that was like at the VFW. And so I have these memories of like not having very much. But then I also have years where I remember more abundance. And there's a new song right now. It's actually kind of a remix. It's Dolly Parton and Pitbull, but they remixed 9 to 5. And Pitbull does this rap about how they were always on layaway. And that really defines my like childhood. My mom always made sure we had brand new clothes to go to school, but we would put them on layaway the entire summer. And then when school started, I always had a new wardrobe just to kick off the school year. And so I have these really powerful memories. But what's interesting about, for me, growing up blue collar is that on one hand, you learn skills like hard work, right? You watch your family go to work every day in sickness and in health. Like, it doesn't matter. You get up and you go to work and you take care of your family. So there's like a positive side to that experience. But then sort of the negative side of hard work is that hard work is usually not enough to make it in a white collar profession. And so when you hard work all of the time and you think, I'm just going to work really hard and the work will speak for itself and I'm going to get a promotion, I'm going to make lots of money, that is not true. That is a fallacy. It's a fictional narrative that we tell ourselves, but it's because the narrative we saw in a blue collar environment where hard work does get you where you need to go. That's what we saw worked, but it doesn't work in a white collar environment, which is why I'm so passionate about first generation because there's so many obstacles and we're all like pioneers navigating, this experience. And so I think about those years, and I also think about the fact that as I was already navigating out of the blue collar world and into a white collar profession as early as middle school. I was taking business classes. I was learning to type. I didn't know what I wanted to be. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that my family had always said like you don't want to work in a factory. You don't want to work, on a farm. Like you don't want to do hard labor. And so those ideas about getting out of the blue collar environment were there really early on. And so I started very early preparing myself for the future, even though I had no idea what was coming.
Oh my gosh. It sounds like at a young age, you're sort of being taught these concepts of optics, career planning, thinking forward, goal setting at a really young age. How do you think that affected you?
I mean, I've read some articles recently about being like parentified as a child. And so I relate with a lot of that content. I was a caretaker for my family. I mean, I learned, my mom was a single mom and she had me and my sister, and we're about 4 years apart. So I was like an only child for a period. And I also have a child who's an only child. And I can tell you from my own experience growing up and is also raising my daughter that there is a certain level of like advanced cognition that happens when you are kind of in this environment where you're always surrounded by adults. So people would always say to me as a kid, "Oh, you're so mature for your age." Or like they would spell words around me thinking I wasn't going to know what they were saying, but I knew what they were saying. I would like, I'd repeat back to them, but I'd use the words instead of the spelling, right? Because even though they were spelling, I understood what they were saying. And so I think that those examples, like kind of, I grew up really fast, but all of that self advocacy was more, I didn't really feel like anyone was teaching me self advocacy. It was just sort of the lesson I was taking out of the information I was given. And I think about examples of having to navigate the world on my own. So, for example, in high school, I knew that we didn't have a lot of money for me to go to college. And so I needed to get a scholarship. So I had to keep my grades up. I had to take as many dual enrollment and honors classes as I possibly could because they pumped up my GPA. And then I was doing all these extra things to try to prepare myself for college. And so one term I got put in like remedial science, and I needed biology to be an honors student. And I was like, this is not acceptable. I'm all in honors classes across the board except for science. So I wrote a letter to every single principal and assistant principal at the high school. I stuck it in all their boxes, basically, I don't want to say demanding, but laying my case out for why I needed to be in this more elevated science course. And finally, someone called me in. I got called to the office. I sat down with one of the principals. We had a conversation and they changed my schedule. But there wasn't anyone guiding those things. They were just things that I knew I needed to do if I, wanted to get to where I was going. And so that's like a really early memory of that self-advocacy. And I would also say too at that point, because I didn't have a lot of information about the world, everything still felt very possible, right? Like I was, what do the kids say? I was a little delulu. I just was like, I'm just gonna make it happen. I'm just gonna do what needs to get done. Like there's nothing I can't overcome. And it's some of that resilience that we talked about in your episode, where it's like you just develop really early and you become this very resilient person, and your tolerance for things becomes really high.
Oh, that's so powerful. And yet the delusion is so real. Also a kid with a single parent, and I was a latchkey kid. And I can tell you, TVs and movies kind of raised me as well. And there were a lot of TV characters or movie characters who were delusionally ambitious and advocating for themselves. And I don't know if that hits for you, if there were any, fake, real, any people or characters in your life that sort of did show you it was okay to stand up for yourself, or if you just created that on your own.
I mean, I had a really interesting childhood because even though my mom was a single parent, at one point, my grandparents moved in with us to help take care of us. And so my mom was like working the night shift. So I would see her in the morning when she was coming home and I was going to school. And then my dad and my mom split when I was 4. And so I never really had a strong relationship with him. But I had an aunt who took me for a while. She lived in a different city than my mom, like a 45-minute drive. And she took me and put me in private school in kindergarten. And I lived with her for a period so that I could go to this special school. But then there was a lot of conflict sometimes between the relationships and dynamics of across the family and like living apart from my mom and my sister and all these challenging things. And I think that's the sort of the crux of where I learned to navigate people's emotions and sort of manage their feelings because I wanted everyone to be happy. I wanted everyone to get along. And I sort of felt like I was at the center of all of that, like it was my responsibility to navigate and manage that particular situation. And I was like 5, 6 years old, when this is happening. I will say though that my mom has a really dynamic group of sisters. And so I say I was raised by this group of women. I just have these like really diverse, dynamic female personas in my life growing up. And it's the combination, I think, of all of that that probably led to the person that I became. But I will say pop culture also played a role in what I thought about what a woman is. And so I remember being, I don't know, 5, 6 years old and watching MTV. And there are two women who really come to mind when I think about like the idea that women are powerful and, and can like do anything and be anything and bold and big. And it's Madonna, which I mean, like, come on, Madonna, like icon, and Janet Jackson. And those two women were so influential in the ideas that I shaped early on about what it meant to be a powerful woman.
Oh, that's so hits. Well, and there, it was an interesting time for a while, right? There was a lot around girl power, and that was kind of starting to take shape, which was a really fun time in pop culture. Very interesting. And I also think there was a really big push for women learning and women's education. What did that mean? And I know I grew up as a very young child being told you could do anything. You could be an astronaut if you wanted to, which I'm sure that older generations can't really relate to. It sounds like you and I had some crossover in some of our upbringing. And I know one big theme for me was education. That was my way out. That was my freedom away from what wasn't working in my life growing up. And so I do want to ask more about that because you brought up school and being really tenacious as a student. And I know that continuous learning is really one of your values for sure. So reflecting on that path to education, I guess, what do you think some of your views on value and purpose of education are, and have those shifted over the years?
Yeah, I think what you said is really probably the start of it, right? Education was the path out. And so, having a family who is blue collar, they knew education was important. It wasn't necessarily that they knew how I needed to navigate it or what I was supposed to do, but they knew I needed to go to school. They knew I needed to go to college if I was going to have that, like if I was going to elevate in life from where I started. And so there was a lot of encouragement to, a big focus on education where it also though became this thing where like honor roll was expected. I was always expected to be like an A-B student. And I think that really speaks to that perfection and like good girl culture. And a lot of that actually did happen, in my formative years. There was a lot of be really good at church and wear the prettiest dress. And my perfection became this thing that brought, in a way, it felt like it brought honor to my family. That sounds a little like weird to say, but it did feel like by me doing these things, not only was I bringing honor to my family, but people loved me more when I was perfect and smart and all of these things. And so I think learning started as a gateway to have a better life. And then over time, interestingly enough, there was a period where it shifted a little bit in meaning for me. And so I started college. Remember, I took all those business classes. So I did all that in middle school and high school. I learned to type and I got all these administrative skills. And I even took a class in entrepreneurship. Like I was just getting the tools I needed like as soon as possible. But then in high school, someone introduced me to photography. And because my family didn't really understand the, like, nuance of higher education, I was able to go to school for art because all they knew was I needed an art or like a college degree. And now all of a sudden I was like obsessed with making art and I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a fashion photographer. That was my goal. I wanted to be a fashion photographer. And I went to school for 4 years for fine art, concentration in photography, but I got to my senior year and realized I didn't really want to be an artist either. I loved making, I loved thinking about art, I loved writing about art. But I looked around the people who were like around me and I thought, these people eat, sleep, breathe. Like they don't, like everything is about making art. And I don't feel that. And so I made another pivot and I thought, well, I've been working part-time in museums and I love like that space. And so I'm going to go to school for a master's in photographic preservation and collections management. And that was probably the best 2 years of my life. I didn't work for the first time since I was 16. I was surrounded by people who shared my interests and had the same type of like passions and, you know, competencies that I had. And so I really felt on par with my peers. And I graduated and thought, okay, now what? Like, got to get a job, right? And so, unfortunately, that's a very niche career path and it doesn't pay very well. And the jobs are far and few between. And so, I stumbled into automotive, which has really, I don't know, it's been amazing. Like, it was like an accident. I took a job. I thought I'll be here 6 months. And I stayed there for 6.5 years and then took another job where I stayed another 6.5 years. So I have 13 years total in the automotive industry. Half of that was in more of the technology side of the business, but I have 13 years of automotive experience. And like you, I climbed the ranks very quickly in both companies. And I got to this place though in my career. I was an executive, I was a VP, reporting to the C-suite. And I thought I could do that. But I thought, what do I need to get like past where I am to where they are? I need an MBA. So I went back to school and I got another master's degree because that degree was no longer about me needing the validation of the degree. It was like my ticket to enter. And so I went back and I got an MBA. And I will tell you, the MBA was great. It was a wonderful experience. I got it from Boston University and it validated in a lot of ways that I already knew what I was doing. I learned a few things. I'm not going to lie. I learned some really interesting stuff. But I will also say there was a lot of validation that came from getting an MBA. And so I knew that was my ticket to the C-suite. And so, what I think is interesting though about like the arc of education and continuous learning, I read a lot of books. I love to get, courses on Coursera. I've done like masterclass, all those things. But I see a pattern in both myself and others that sometimes these degrees are ways of like proving our worth, right? And so like it's like, oh, well, if I just get a certificate, then they'll know I'm good enough to do it. And so I think that's one of the interesting parts of my MBA. Like I said, it was one of those things where it just validated I already knew a lot of stuff. And I already had like the right thought processes about certain things. And so I don't know, education is like this weird thing. It's like for those of us who come maybe from, a blue collar background or a working class background, often a degree is a ticket to get in. And I know there's a lot of dialogue about this right now, Rose. Like, people are saying like, is this necessary? Like, why do we put these parameters on things? But I will also say that I get a lot of fulfillment out of the like learning process. And some of the times in my life when I've been the most whole version of myself was when I was in more of like an education setting.
Oh, wow. That is such a beautiful part of your story to share because I think it just shows the realistic side of some of your motivation, but also what it unlocked. I think it's really powerful. You're sort of demonstrating I'll call it an energy exchange, if you will, of what does that degree or certificate give you it's clear that when you are learning, there's also sort of an energy exchange of you're in your highest self mode or something. I'm curious though, because we talk about this a lot as entrepreneurs. What does that energy exchange look like when you decide to make an investment like that? Because that is not nothing. That's a lot of time, money, and energy. So what does that look like for you to decide at all these different points in your life education is the right investment at this time?
Well, I'd start by saying I typically have this bias towards action. And so when I decide that something needs to happen, I just kind of move. And so with the MBA, it was kind of like that. It was like, okay, I need this thing. And at the time, I wasn't a VP. I knew there was a good chance that I was getting promoted. And so I actually went to the CEO and the CFO at the time and I said, look, I'm considering getting an MBA, but I'm not going to enroll in this course if it's going to prevent you from promoting me to vice president. So I need to know if you think this is a conflict. And thankfully, both of them were very supportive. And they even wrote my letters of recommendation because you have to like put a whole packet together to even get into school. And so the CEO and the CFO both wrote me letters of recommendation to help me get into the program at Boston University. And so that was like kind of this like pivotal moment. But when I think about now where I am as an entrepreneur, it's interesting because I don't ever think, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I don't think anything ever gets wasted. Like sometimes things come a little bit full circle. And so when I think back to like my first master's degree in photographic preservation and collections management, that's about the physical and intellectual organization of art items, right? So you have to be able to conceptually decide how to track them and keep organized with them. But then you also have to physically organize them. And so you can then, if you think about then my first job in automotive where I was over marketing and business development, I've got this fine art background, right? So that like helps me plug right into marketing, transferable skills. Then I have this capacity to understand the organization of items in a dealership. That's people. And so you have CRM systems that you have to figure out, like, how am I organizing my audience? And so that plugged right in. And, you know, all through all of that, I was always overseeing people. I was always innovating and like moving things forward. And so when I think about how all this comes together, right now I'm an entrepreneur and I have this like big basket full of skills that I've picked up over the years. Some of them from school, some of them from life, but all from continuous learning and most of them transferable.
You really have. You've kind of gathered a big basket, actually, of amazing skills. And I would ask in a different direction, I guess, what do you think are the values or passions that you've also collected in this basket along the way? Because I think you and I both know just learning or just education does not make a great coach. You've got to have those other ingredients too.
You know, I have the values that I sort of present as these days as like my core pillars. And so I talk a lot about story because I realize how important my own story has been and how my career has progressed. There was a time when it was the chip on my shoulder. Sort of like I came from this blue collar background and I can kick ass and I could get it done. And I'm going to prove to you that I am valuable and worthy. And so it was like this chip right on my shoulder. And so, I mean, I see that story, like, I also see how story holds people back and I see how story propels people forward. And so I think our stories are so important. And someone once said to me, well, Heather, everybody has a story. And we do. And it's really fucking important that we understand those stories because, like, if you're a leader and you don't understand someone's backstory, you don't really understand what motivates them, how they make decisions, like how they think about their work, and maybe even how to help them navigate the next phase of their career or, you know, set boundaries between work and life. You have to know a little bit about their story. So that's one. The second one is candor. I think candor actually probably ties really well to both story and to another one of my pillars, which is self-advocacy. And so you really need to be candid. I think there's a lot of vulnerability and empathy buried in candor. And Brene Brown loves to say that clear is kind. And so I'm a big fan of candor from like that perspective. which then takes us, of course, to self-advocacy. And I think I've talked a lot about how I've seen self-advocacy show up in my own career, but I've also seen it show up for my employees. And so, when I coach people, I talk about the fact that there are three things that really impact your career progression. There's the things that you do, right? So that's like your personal branding, your hard work, your self-advocacy, all the things that you can control. Then there's your boss, because ideally you have a good boss and they're mentoring you, coaching you, and they're also advocating for you. They're the person saying your name in the rooms that you're not in. And then the third pillar are the needs of the business. And that's the one where we really often get hung up in our careers because we think, I've worked hard, my boss loves me, everything's going great, like I should be promoted, I should get more money. But what we don't factor in is that sometimes where we are in our career, the things that we're ready for, the things that we need, don't necessarily align with where the business currently is. And so you really need those three things in alignment. So, that's kind of where this self-advocacy ties in, is like understanding that and be able to navigate all those things. Then my fourth pillar is authenticity, which I know is a bit of a buzzword, but I think about authenticity as like things, for example, intentional authenticity. So we talk about bringing our whole selves to work. Not everybody wants to bring their whole self to work, but I do think people want to bring a real version of themselves to work. And so that's where I think intentional authenticity comes in. I can also tell you, for a big part of my career, I've had to compartmentalize aspects of who I am. So, for example, when I worked in certain roles, I maybe had to put certain aspects of my creative side maybe to the side, or, I had to be a certain kind of person to fit into a certain kind of environment. And so I was like compartmentalizing and prioritizing aspects of myself. What I'd like to see for the rest of my life is a more unified approach to how I show up in the world. And so I think that's one reason why I lean so heavily on this concept of authenticity. I don't want to say I've ever shown up fake, because I don't think that I have, but I definitely think I haven't shown up as a unified version of myself. Like, people have gotten pieces or aspects of myself, my being. And so I think that's why authenticity is so important.
Oh, this makes so much sense with your story. When I hear back in your earlier storytelling where you asked principals to let you into science class, where you told senior leadership you needed to know if the MBA was worth it. It's all starting to really make sense. That self-advocacy piece, that you sort of see all these bigger pieces of the puzzle come together. I will say, as an outsider, that sounds like a lot of weight to carry around all the time. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit, of sort of constantly managing all those different optics and pieces to be able to create your own success.
Yeah, I will say, Rose, there have been times where when I've attempted, in the past to be maybe a more holistic version of myself, that I have been burned, And so the message I kept getting was, be a good girl, show up the way you're supposed to. And that didn't mitigate or undermine my self advocacy, but it did. You know how I rationalized it? I always said I was being strategic. It was a game of chess, right? Everything was a game of chess, and I just had to be strategic in how I showed up and navigated and did all of these things. And so, I mean, it was heavy, and there have been times that it's been, you know, painful, and there have been times that I've wondered, did I make trade-offs with things that maybe I didn't want? Did I sell out? When I left the nonprofit art space and moved into automotive, I moved into a space that was much more lucrative. And, I was climbing the corporate ladder, as they say. And there were moments where I looked at some of my colleagues that I had gone to graduate school with, and I thought, did I sell out? Did I sort of trade my passions for my profession? And I guess if you position it that way, I did. But I will say, I'm learning now, especially talking to people on this podcast, that sometimes it's okay to have sort of this separation. Like, you can have a career that isn't something that you're necessarily passionate about. You can be successful. You can even enjoy it. I enjoyed a lot of my career. I never knew I was going to be doing all the things I did, and I enjoyed a significant portion of it. When it was good, it was good. And it was good more often than it was bad. But there were times that it was bad. And, and there were times I got burned. And so when I think about all of that, I think that really is why like this chapter now as an entrepreneur with all of the control that I have over my schedule, my life, my choices, it just puts me in like a totally different mindset. So
Ooh, yeah, that's huge. I think I want to pull at that thread a little bit of the freedom, the liberation there. Cause I think along with, I see this in myself, my clients, along with a lot of imposter syndrome or trying to fit in where you need to fit in to be strategic, I think comes a lot of code switching and exhaustion and all of that. And so, what does that look like? I guess has that come up for you? And then separately, what does that look like now that you don't have to do that all the time?
historically I've probably done some code switching over the years. It's something I have reflected on. And I think that's where that sort of, ununified approach to showing up in the world has come from. It's been especially hard because for the last 13 years, I have been in two like male dominated industries. And I'm not trying to make this like a she versus he situation. Like it's not that. But I will tell you that there are plenty of times that I was the only woman at the table. I took clients out to dinner one time and I was on the road, so I was like in a different state, different place that I didn't live. I had these clients come meet me for dinner. And if you can imagine like this big round table at this restaurant and it's like all men and then me, and I'm the one picking up the check. So it's like there were moments like that where it was just like a little bit, you felt weird. It wasn't bad. It wasn't bad that I was the only woman, but it did feel like weird at times. I feel like there were times in all of that too where, you know, I could tell people were trying to, let's say, manipulate me as an example. And I, I had the idea up here. I understood what was happening. And I let them think, that like they had some sway. But again, it was like, oh, I'm more strategic than that. Like I can navigate this. But I wasn't always as in control as I thought I was. And so like as you can imagine, just it gets messy. It gets messy.
So messy. And I think that's so human. Like we're just trying our best. Truly, we're just trying our best to be what we can. And so then now that you've gone off on your own, what does that feel like to not need to sort of fit in or be smaller?
It's been an interesting transition. I will say that coming out of the burnout, I started getting a lot more perspective on like being present. So prior to leaving the corporate world, my identity was very tied to my job. I put in a lot of hours. I mean, I often had very little left for my family after a day of work. And so I think coming through the other side and trying to like regroup and reflect and put myself back together, I have really come to honor and respect this idea of like being more present. So I think that was like the first key thing. The other thing that's been really interesting, and this has not been purposeful, but it's just sort of happened, is as an entrepreneur, I've been networking and joining like different organizations. And I've joined groups like Tara, which is very female forward. I've joined this leads group called She Leads. And so as you can imagine, it's all women. And so I went from a life of very like male dominated, often being the only, to this environment now where it's very like matriarchal. I'm around a lot of women like when I go and do things. And that has been like really interesting. I was at a conference. Tara put on a conference last year, and it was a great presentation. We had great speakers and great information. And I've been to many conferences. I've been to so many conferences. I've even presented at conferences. And I'm at this conference and I'm looking around and I have this moment where I realize that like I'm the same as everybody else, right? Like we're all the same. And there's so many smart, intelligent people sitting around me, and we're all ambitious, and it's like really beautiful. And I sit back in my chair and I think, this must be what it feels like to be a man. Because you go places and everybody looks and feels and behaves similar to you. And I just never had a moment where that felt that way. And I was just like, this must be what it feels like to be a man, is like surrounded by peers and feel like you're the same as everybody. And I don't know, it was like this just really weird like epiphany in that moment.
That is really big. Okay, so this is kind of a fun question then. If you could bottle that feeling to gift to clients and help them feel empowered, because that's a really empowered place to be in, what would you bottle? What would that look like?
I don't know. I think when I think about how this impacts like clients, I think a lot of things are motivated by fear. And something I always said to my direct reports and people on my team and heck even my friends, most decisions, like most choices that we make are not one directional. So it's like, you can usually pivot from something, undo something, correct something. And so the only decisions that need maybe multiple perspectives are the ones that you are confident that you can't undo. And so I think if people could navigate their lives and careers with a little bit more of that ideology that, like, this is a test, and if it doesn't go the way I want it to, I can do something different. But I think we go into life with very black and white thinking. I'm guilty of it. I'm not, there's no judgment here in this dialogue. But I think we all get kind of stuck in this very like black and white thinking where if we make a choice or if we do something, it has to be a certain way. I do this with events. Like if I have a party at my house, I need everything clean, I need everything perfect, I need all the food to be a certain way, like, it has to be ideal, and I get really anxious leading up to the event, and then sometimes I have this moment where I'm like, "No one is gonna fucking remember a month from now if, the cups didn't match the plates, or, I ran out of napkins and we had to use paper towels." Like, just, like, these really stupid, like, inconsequential things. And so I am getting better, but I also would want to give that to my clients. It's like, it doesn't have to be perfect. You can change course. Like, this doesn't define your life, right? And your life is so much bigger than your career. Your career is a part of your life, but your life is so much bigger than your career. And so, I don't know, other than just like talking and coaching and helping people reflect on their own stories and all of that. I don't know how else you bottle that, but I would want to move away from this like motivation of fear and more towards like curiosity, right? Like innovation, creativity. Those are the things I want people to move towards.
Oh my gosh. I honestly have chills a little just hearing your story come so full circle. When you shared your childhood with us and the education journey, perfectionism and being perfect and making sure everything was A plus all the time was sort of how you unlocked freedom. And now it feels later in life, it's that curiosity and ability to mess up and trial and error and everything's okay is now what it seems is like actually unlocks freedom for you.
Yeah, I'd say it's a lesson, we've talked a lot about lessons. It's a lesson that I started learning in the automotive industry. So it began with outsider thinking. So I was an outsider coming into the automotive space at a dealership, and I was taking over business development and marketing, and I had this outsider perspective. And so I didn't want to do the things that other car dealerships were doing. I wanted to think about like, who do we sit parallel to, and how do we marry things that they're doing to things that are normal for our industry. And so I didn't know that I was innovating, but I wanted to build something novel out of like combining things that had never been maybe combined before. So it started there. And by the time I went all the way and I got my MBA, we actually had an entire semester on innovation. And I had already been working with like design thinking with my training team. And so, it was all coming together. Things that I had intuitively done were now starting to have words attached to them. And another discovery that I've recently made is design thinking, and then in the art community, studio thinking are both frameworks that have very similar principles. And so I think about now all that art education, all that like transferable skills. I mean, I say this all the time. People make fun of people with like art degrees because they're like, well, you couldn't do anything else. And are you just going to be a poor, starving artist? And what they don't realize is that liberal arts degrees, fine arts degrees, they're these really very holistic approaches to learning. You learn history, you learn psychology, you learn math, you learn business, you learn creativity, you learn, trial and error, these like mental skills that you learn. It all comes together for me right now.
Yeah, you've shared so generously so much of your story with us today and all you had all these different pieces sort of come together. Now that you're speaking it out loud, do you notice any other full circle moments or full circle, I guess, concepts that have come with you the whole time?
I mean, I think I not so much speaking it, but just like recently, being a coach and working with people in their careers. I think often we assume success is like linear and everything is going to go a certain way, and that we have to have this history that follows a certain path. And my journey didn't follow a certain path, and most people's journeys don't follow a certain path. And at the end of the day, we have to remember the thing that makes it unique, the thing that connects it all is us, which comes back to story, candor, self advocacy, authenticity. It all comes back full circle to this like more cohesive, unified, you know, person. And I wish I had learned these lessons sooner, but I'm there now, so
You're there now. Absolutely. I mean, would you change anything now knowing what you know?
no, no. Someone asked me recently, we were talking about childhoods and life, and they were saying, do you ever say to yourself, that's not fair? I've never said that's not fair. At least in that context. I'm not going to say I've never said the words, that's not fair. But in the context of looking back at my history, my life, my choices, my career, my education, I never look at that and think that's not fair. I think things like, wow, that happened to you. There's a certain level of gratitude for things. Like, I know I'm very privileged. I don't know how that happened. I didn't start in that place in life, you know? But I remember, I think back to things like when I was a little kid, my aunt somehow got to take me to Europe for one of those trips where you hit like a bunch of places in like a very short period of time. I don't know how we afforded it. I don't know how I got to go. My mom let me go with my aunt to Europe. And we went to the Louvre in Paris. And I saw Liberty leading the people. Strong female, one breast exposed, arm raised in the air. I saw this painting and it like imprinted on me. And I think it's probably also contributed to female power, empowerment, all of those things. I think it contributed to my sort of artistic and creativity, like, wanting to be more in that space. Such an early memory, such an impactful moment. And I don't know how it happened. I don't know how I was privileged enough to have that experience. But I've been back to that painting at least 3 times in my life now. And I think to myself, wow, this is really amazing. I think about the life that I've built, this home that I purchased. Like, my husband and I do things together. I don't want to discredit his contributions, but I was the breadwinner for many years. And that means something to me. And it's again not to discredit the efforts of my husband. I know that I couldn't have done it all without him. It's been in having a great partner who supports my career endeavors, who helps raise our child, who, when I worked, traveling and I was on the road 80% of the time, was basically a single parent Monday through Friday. I couldn't have done all this without him. But I don't also want to discredit the things that I've been able to accomplish as someone who grew up with very little, who, climbed their way to the top. I want to give myself the credit for the labor that I put in to get here. I think the challenges, and I think people who come from the same background as I do share this, is there's always that little part of you that's waiting for the other shoe to drop, and you always have a little bit of that scarcity mindset that, like, despite all that I've been able to accomplish and all that I've accumulated and all that I've created, it could all just go away again. And I could be back to where I started. And so I always carry a little bit of that doubt and that sense of fear that we talked about, that fear that we can't really get rid of. And so I have those moments where I have to remind myself that I've faced obstacles and I've overcome most of them, and so I have to remind myself that I have a history of accomplishing things, a history of resilience, a history of overcoming, a bias towards action. I figure things out. And so sometimes I have to have those moments where I remind myself of what I have done so that I can kind of push aside that idea that, like, it could all just go away.
Oh, wow. That's really powerful too, that voice, that quiet voice. And I would say, do you think you quiet it? Do you think you leverage it or a little bit of both?
Probably a little bit of both, Rose. I mean, I do think having a little bit of scarcity always kind of motivates you to keep going. So it can be a positive thing, right? It can be part of your motivation, but it can also motivate you in a negative way. And so that's where I have to always make sure that I'm, doing self-care and set in some boundaries, because you don't want that little voice that says like you could lose it all if you stop. You could lose it all if you rest. You could lose it all if you don't whatever, fill in the blank. And so it has sort of a like a yin and yang like concept to it, and it kind of fits both components. And so I do think you leverage it, but you also have to keep it in check.
Oh, that hits so hard. If you don't know lack, how do you have appreciation for abundance? It has been so beautiful hearing your story and how it comes together, your values. Is there anything else you want everyone to know about how your story has shaped you and gotten you here today?
I think I have these moments, and this is probably a little bit even of like the imposter syndrome, but as an entrepreneur, I have these moments where I look at these other folks who sort of lead in their marketing and their communications with these really definitive statements. And while I understand that that's great marketing and it really compels people, it's not true, right? Like none of us are like definitive. Most things are understood in hindsight. Success is not linear, and success is also self-defined. I mean, I did the corporate thing for a long time, and I followed the rules and I played the game and I did all the things and I was successful by all measures. It was, I had a good title, I made a lot of money, I had a lot of flexibility, I built a beautiful life. And I burnt out and I was depressed and it got bad. And I don't blame the work for that. I mean, I will say the work environment contributed to the place I was in, but I also, because I let my identity get so caught up in all of that, and I was chasing money and my job as a means to an end, right? So even though I enjoyed it, like I said earlier, money is not a motivator for me. I think money it buys you things like freedom. And so I was working hard because I thought if I work hard enough now, I can really enjoy my life later. And if any significant changes happened, I realize now that I need to enjoy my life now. And hopefully I get to enjoy it later too, but like I feel more it feels more important now to both work hard and do all of the things, but also to be in a space where I am enjoying my life. I'm taking care of myself. And I always say on this podcast, it's time to own your story. I am owning my story now. And, I take ownership of all the things that have happened and I understand them in hindsight, but I also look to the future and I want to write those next chapters. So, I mean, I think that's full circle where I am.
Wow. It feels strange to be saying this to you, but I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. Wow, that is so beautiful. Okay, so there's been so much covered today, so many beautiful stories shared. If someone said, "This is too long, I did not listen," what is the one thing you'd want them to take away from this beautiful conversation?
I think it's really important that people recognize that there's something special in all of us, and everybody has such great potential, and sometimes you have enough curiosity about it to navigate it yourself. Sometimes you need the help of others, a mentor, a friend, a coach, whoever, to help you recognize it in yourself. But I think everybody has something special to offer. And I think if you're in a space where you don't feel special and you don't feel like you have something special to offer the situation, then you might be in a role or a job or a place that isn't in alignment with your values. And so I think it's really important to figure out what you do value and then to make sure that the choices you're making, the places that you are, and the people you surround yourself with are in alignment with those values. And I can't say that that's the key to happiness because I'm still figuring that out too. I'm on my own journey, but I will say that it certainly does help. So I would just encourage everyone to get clear on your values and then assess your situation and make sure that everything feels in alignment. And then all those other pieces, all those other things you're looking for, it all just kind of falls into place. Without sounding too woo-woo, I do think the universe does provide certain things if you can get yourself in the right position. So I will leave everyone with that.
Oh my gosh, so good. Okay, well, on behalf of everyone, thank you for being in the hot seat today.
Thank you so much for doing this, Rose. I know it was like a little bit of like a weird role reversal, but I really just wanted an opportunity to also tell and share my story. So thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.